A morning in late May of 2021 on the Bermejo River in El Impenetrable National Park in the northern Argentine province of Chaco. A biologist named Sebastian Di Martino stood along the muddy bank with a camera trap in his hands, checking the memory card. The park had been established 7 years earlier through a donation from Tompkins Conservation and the Argentine non-profit Rewilding Argentina, where Di Martino serves as conservation director. He was reviewing footage from the previous week, standard fieldwork, the kind of work he had done thousands of times over the 2 decades of his career. Then he stopped scrolling. On the small screen, moving through the shallow water of the Bermejo, was an animal that had not been documented in Argentina for approximately 35 years. A solitary young adult male, roughly 6 feet long from nose to tail, weighing perhaps 30 kilograms. His throat was marked with a distinctive irregular white patch that his species carries as a natural fingerprint, each individual bearing a pattern as unique as human fingerprints. Di Martino's own account of that moment, later published in an interview with the Argentine journalism organization Orato, described what happened next in his body. His legs weakened. He felt like he was falling. His heart began to race. The animal in the video was a giant otter, Pteronura brasiliensis. His species have been formally considered extinct across the entire Argentine Republic since 1986. The nearest known breeding population, according to the peer-reviewed geographic reconstruction, was approximately 1,000 kilometers away in the interior wetlands of eastern Paraguay. How the solitary male had reached the Bermejo River in northern Argentina was not, in that moment, clear. What was clear was that Di Martino was looking at a video of the first confirmed wild giant otter documented on Argentine territory in over 3.5 decades. He did not know it yet, but he was also looking at the beginning of what would become 4 years later, in July of 2025, the first successful worldwide comeback of the giant otter to a habitat from which the species had been rendered locally extinct, and the first mammal ever declared extinct across an entire South American country to be brought back through active reintroduction. I want to tell you how that happened, because the specific chain of scientific coordination, international zoo collaboration, and quiet, decades-long persistence that produced the July 2025 moment is one of the most remarkable conservation stories currently unfolding on any continent. And the specific details of how it was accomplished, including the international recruitment of breeding candidates from 4 different European countries, the development of specialized GPS harness technology, and the environmental DNA monitoring system now tracking the ecological consequences of the release, is a story that virtually no one outside the specific circle of South American mammal researchers has heard. Let me start with what the animal actually is, because to understand the loss and the return, you have to understand her. The giant otter is the largest otter species on the planet. Adults reach lengths of approximately 1 8/10 meters, or roughly 5 feet 9 inches. Weights of 30 to 34 kilograms. Body proportions dominated by a long, tapering, muscular tail, approximately 1/3 of the total body length. Webbed feet. Waterproof fur so dense that individual guard hairs interlock to form what is functionally a wetsuit. Small ears that close when the animal submerges. A flat white or pale cream throat marking, unique to each individual, used by researchers as the primary field identification tool. She is social. She lives in family groups of up to 15 individuals, typically consisting of a breeding pair and their multiple generations of offspring. She is active during the day, unlike most mustelids, which allows her to hunt visually in the specific turbid conditions of tropical South American rivers. She is territorial, marking her range with scent glands and vocal calls that carry across the water. Her diet consists almost entirely of fish. A single family group has been documented consuming as much as 10 kilograms of fish per day, occupying a specific stretch of river or lagoon that the group defends against neighboring groups. She is also, in the specific ecological sense that matters here, an apex predator of the freshwater ecosystems she inhabits. Her removal from an aquatic ecosystem is not a neutral loss. It restructures the entire food web. Fish populations, particularly the mid-sized piscivorous fish species that have been kept in check by the otter's predation, expand dramatically. Smaller fish species, particularly the specific herbivorous minnows that graze on aquatic vegetation, decline as the larger fish consume them. Aquatic vegetation, no longer grazed at the previous rate, overgrows. Water clarity changes. Nutrient cycling changes. The specific composition of invertebrate populations changes. The ecosystem, in the technical language of trophic ecology, restructures. Her historical range, according to the peer-reviewed reconstruction, covered essentially every major freshwater watershed in tropical and subtropical South America. From the Orinoco Basin in what is now Venezuela, south through the Amazon, into the Paraná and Paraguay river systems, and reaching the northern Argentine wetlands, including the Ibera system in Corrientes province and the Chaco wetlands of what is now the Argentine northwest. That range began to collapse in the second half of the 19th century. The specific driver of the collapse was the international fur trade. Giant otter pelts, with their dense waterproof fur and distinctive silver-brown coloration, commanded exceptional prices in the European and North American luxury markets of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A single high-quality pelt could sell for the equivalent of several months of ordinary agricultural wages. Hunters, primarily working from small river camps across the Amazon and Paraná basins, systematically targeted the species. Family groups, which normally offered strong collective defense against most predators, proved catastrophically vulnerable to human hunters. A single hunter could locate a group by their daytime activity and their loud vocalizations, position himself along the riverbank, and shoot the entire family within minutes. According to the peer-reviewed reconstruction of the historical fur trade, between 1946 and 1971 alone, approximately 24,000 giant otter pelts were exported from the Amazon basin. By the early 1970s, the species had been reduced across most of its former range to isolated remnant populations, primarily in the most inaccessible portions of the Amazon and Pantanal. In Argentina specifically, the decline was compounded by additional pressures beyond the fur trade. Large-scale hydroelectric dam construction in the Paraná basin fragmented the specific river systems that had connected the Argentine giant otter populations to the broader continental range. Cattle ranching and agricultural drainage of the Ibera wetlands eliminated substantial portions of the specific habitat the species required. Water pollution from expanding agricultural operations reduced fish populations in the specific river reaches the otters had historically depended on. The last breeding population of giant otters in Argentina, according to the confirmed sighting records compiled by the Argentine master zoology community, was documented in the province of Misiones in 1986. Occasional solitary individuals, most likely dispersers from the surviving Paraguayan or Brazilian populations, were reported through the subsequent decades, but no confirmed family group, no breeding activity, and no evidence of a self-sustaining population survived on Argentine territory after 1986. The species, in the formal designation used by the Argentine Society for the Study of Mammals, was declared nationally extinct. That was the situation when a specific idea began to take shape at Rewilding Argentina in 2017. Rewilding Argentina, founded as the Argentine offspring of the American conservation organization Tompkins Conservation, had by that point been operating in the Ibera wetlands for 5 years. The broader Ibera rewilding program had been assembled by a small team of Argentine biologists working under the leadership of Conservation Director Sebastián Di Martino, in coordination with the provincial government of Corrientes and the Argentine National Parks Administration. The program had already begun the reintroduction of the giant anteater, the pampas deer, the collared peccary, the red and green macaw. Planning was underway for the jaguar reintroduction that would eventually launch in 2021. Di Martino had a specific expertise. Born in 1968 in the coastal city of Bahia Blanca in the Buenos Aires province, he had trained as a biologist at the National University of La Plata and had spent his career focused on the specific problem of restoring apex predators to landscapes from which they had been eliminated. He had worked on jaguar biology in Argentine Chaco. He had studied the ecological consequences of apex predator loss across multiple South American systems. He understood at the level of specific field practice what the return of a top predator to a degraded ecosystem could produce. The 2017 planning document for the giant otter reintroduction, formally reviewed in a paper published later that year by Talia Zamboni, Sebastián Di Martino, and Ignacio Jiménez Pérez in the journal Perspectives in Ecology and Conservation, laid out the case. The Ibera wetlands, which had been the specific habitat the giant otter had occupied in Argentina before its extinction, still met the ecological requirements of the species. Water quality had improved in the specific reaches proposed for release. Fish populations, which had recovered substantially since the elimination of commercial fishing in the protected areas, were sufficient to support giant otter families. The threats that had originally driven the species to extinction, particularly the fur trade, had been effectively eliminated by international wildlife protection law and by the specific enforcement structures now operating within the Ibera park system. What was missing in 2017 was the giant otters themselves. There were no wild source breeding candidates available in Argentina. The nearest wild population was in Paraguay, but Paraguay had its own severely reduced population that could not sustain the removal of breeding animals for export. Brazilian wild populations, while larger, were also under significant pressure and were not, at the specific policy level, available for international transfer. The only source of breeding candidates that would not further stress a wild population, according to the analysis Di Martino and his team completed, was the specific network of European and North American zoos that had been maintaining captive giant otter breeding programs since the 1970s. The international recruitment began in 2018. The first candidate to arrive was a female named Alondra, an 8-year-old giant otter from the Budapest Zoo in Hungary. She had been born in captivity, had reached breeding age without being paired, and was assessed by the Rewilding Argentina team as an appropriate candidate for the specific requirements of the reintroduction. She travelled from Budapest to Buenos Aires under specialised veterinary supervision, spent an extended quarantine period in a facility in the town of San Cayetano in Corrientes province, and was eventually transported to an 800 square metre semi-natural enclosure built on the specific island of San Alonso in the heart of the Iberá wetlands. She was, at that point, the only giant otter in Argentina. The second candidate arrived in 2019. a 4-year-old male named Lobo from the Parken Zoo in the Swedish city of Eskilstuna. He completed the same quarantine protocol, the same acclimatization sequence, and was eventually introduced into the shared enclosure with Alondra. The pairing was not immediately successful. Giant otters, unlike many carnivore species, do not always form breeding pairs simply because they are placed together. They require specific social conditions, specific temperament compatibility, and specific timing. The third and fourth candidates arrived over the subsequent years. A male named Coco from the Givskud Zoo in Denmark transported to Iberá in 2020. A female named Nima from the Madrid Zoo in Spain, arriving somewhat later. Coco and Nima, unlike the previous pairing attempt, produced immediate compatibility. Their first 2 litters were unsuccessful. Their third litter, born in the pre-release enclosure in the wetlands during the summer of 2024, produced 2 cubs. Their names, given by the Rewilding Argentina team following the family's Guarani cultural naming conventions, were Pirú and Kyra. Additional pairing efforts continued at other facilities. A female named Tama and her mate Anori produced a subsequent litter in a separate enclosure. The captive breeding program, spanning 4 European zoos across 4 different countries and eventually involving multiple family units at various stages of preparation, had, by mid-2025, assembled the largest captive breeding population of giant otters ever maintained on South American soil. Let me be direct about the technical complications, because they matter. Giant otters are, in real physical terms, exceptionally difficult animals to work with. They are strong, they are social, they are intelligent. They do not tolerate the specific management interventions that other reintroduction candidates accept. Fitting an individual with a tracking collar, which is standard practice for jaguar and puma reintroductions, is not possible with a giant otter. Their neck-to-shoulder body proportions do not accept collars, and their aquatic behavior would compromise any collar that could be fitted. The Rewilding Argentina team, working with specialized wildlife telemetry engineers, had to develop an entirely new tracking system. The specific solution was a custom harness made of soft, biocompatible materials incorporating a satellite GPS transmitter designed to survive months of submerged aquatic use, and to be worn by an animal that would spend most of its active hours in the water. The satellite GPS transmitter, once operational, would provide the specific location data necessary to monitor the post-release survival, dispersal, and family group formation of the reintroduced otters. Without it, the team would have no way of knowing whether the release had succeeded or failed until years later, when either the population had established or the animals had disappeared. The second technical innovation was the Environmental DNA Monitoring System, or eDNA. Standard fish population monitoring requires netting, physical capture, and species identification through hand examination. Netting a giant otter's territory to census the fish population, however, would disrupt the specific ecological system the reintroduction was designed to restore. The team, working with molecular biology partners at Argentine research universities, developed a protocol for extracting environmental DNA directly from water samples collected across the release area. The technique allowed the researchers to determine from a single water sample which fish species were present in the sampled water body, and, with additional analysis, to estimate their relative abundance. The system produced a specific pre-release baseline of the Ibera fish community. Post-release monitoring would allow the team to measure, in real quantitative terms, how the reintroduced otter families were reshaping the aquatic food web. The specific moment the international project had been building toward for 8 years happened on July 1st, 2025. At Laguna Paraná, one of the interior lakes of the Ibera system, the enclosure gate was opened. 4 giant otters walked out. Coco, Nima. Their 2 sub-adult offspring, Pirú and Kyra. Behind them, the specific team of biologists, veterinarians and support staff that had worked on the reintroduction watched from a distance. The animals hesitated at the water's edge for a specific interval. They looked back. Then they entered the water. According to the subsequent monitoring data, they did not stray far from the release point during the first days. They explored the immediate area. They fished. They marked territory with the specific scent glands the species uses to establish family range. Coco led. Nima followed. The 2 cubs, following the standard behavioral protocol of giant otter family groups, stayed close to their parents through the initial acclimatization period. The event, in the specific words of the Rewilding Argentina team, was the first time in recorded conservation history that a species had been successfully reintroduced to a location from which it had been rendered locally extinct across an entire country. It was the first time a mammal declared extinct in Argentina had been brought back through active management. It was the first successful worldwide comeback of the giant otter to any part of its former range from which the species had disappeared. Kristine McDivitt Tompkins, the American conservationist who had co-founded Tompkins Conservation with her late husband Douglas, and who serves as a United Nations patron of protected areas, described the release in a subsequent public statement as a demonstration that ecosystem restoration remains possible at continental scale, and as an example of what long-term conservation, scientific collaboration, and human dedication can produce when they are sustained across the specific timescales that recovery of critically depleted species requires. The broader Ibera rewilding program, of which the giant otter release is now a specific component, continues to expand. Jaguars, first released into the Ibera system in 2021, have established a population that current estimates place between 16 confirmed individuals and possibly as many as 35 to 40. Additional giant otter families are being prepared for release in both the Ibera system and the Gran Chaco wetlands to the northwest. The specific ecological connectivity between the Argentine reintroduction sites and the remaining wild populations in Paraguay and Brazil is being actively negotiated through international cooperation frameworks. Let me be direct about the honest complications because they matter. 4 otters do not constitute a self-sustaining population. The specific demographic viability of a giant otter population, according to the peer-reviewed population genetics analysis, requires multiple family groups distributed across a specific minimum area with sufficient genetic diversity to avoid the inbreeding depression that would eventually collapse a population founded on a small number of captive-bred individuals. Rewilding Argentina has been explicit that the July 2025 release is the first family, not the final one, and that additional releases are planned across the subsequent years. The specific European zoo populations from which the founding animals were drawn are themselves not large. The 4 family lines represented in the Ibera founding population, sourced from Budapest, Eskilstuna, Givskud and Madrid, share ancestry that traces back to a specific number of wild-caught individuals that entered the international captive breeding program in the 1970s and 1980s. Genetic diversity across the founding population is limited. Additional infusions of genetic material from other captive facilities and potentially from carefully coordinated exchanges with Paraguayan and Brazilian wild populations will likely be required to maintain long-term genetic health. Hunting pressure, while dramatically reduced from the levels of the fur trade era, has not entirely disappeared from the broader region. Wildlife trafficking networks continue to operate across the porous borders of the Paraná Basin, particularly in areas where enforcement is weak. The specific protection status of the Ibera wetlands, secured through the Corrientes provincial government and the Argentine National Parks Administration, provides substantial defence within the reserve boundaries. Outside those boundaries, the situation is less certain. Water quality in the broader Paraná Basin continues to be affected by agricultural runoff, dam operations, and industrial pollution. The specific fish populations the giant otters depend on are vulnerable to changes in water chemistry that lie substantially outside the direct management authority of the Ibera park system. Long-term giant otter recovery will require the broader watershed to remain hydrologically and chemically healthy, which depends on management decisions being made at the level of national and international policy. Climate change, as with all reintroduction programs, introduces uncertainty that cannot be fully assessed at the time the release is made. The specific temperature and precipitation regime the giant otters historically depended on is shifting. Whether the founding population and its descendants will remain compatible with the future Ibera climate depends on how much and how rapidly the local climate changes over the coming decades. But the animals are there. On the day I am writing this, Coco, Nima, Pirú and Kyra are somewhere in the specific waterways of Laguna Paraná and the connected lagoons of the Ibera system, hunting fish that no giant otter has hunted on Argentine territory for approximately 40 years. The GPS harnesses on the adults are transmitting location data every specific number of hours. The environmental DNA sampling program is documenting the changes in the fish community that their presence is beginning to produce. Additional families are in preparation. The specific ecological role that the species had played in the Ibera system before the fur trade removed her is being quietly and carefully put back in place. The specific chain of individual actions that produce this outcome deserves to be recognized. The biologist Sebastián Di Martino, who saw the wild male on his camera trap footage in May 2021 and understood immediately what he was looking at. The Argentine research team who developed the specific quarantine, breeding and pre-release protocols that made the international transfer possible. The staff of the Budapest Zoo, the Parken Zoo in Eskilstuna, the Givskud Zoo and the Madrid Zoo, who prepared the founding animals for transfer with the specific attention to their long-term welfare that international species reintroduction requires. Kristine McDivitt Tompkins and the broader Tompkins Conservation Network, whose specific philanthropic commitment allowed the Ibera park system to be assembled in the first place. The provincial government of Corrientes and the Argentine National Parks Administration, whose specific policy support made the reintroduction legally and administratively possible. The deeper thesis the giant otter reintroduction offers, I think, is one that the conservation community is still absorbing. The historical assumption in much of Western conservation practice had been that species declared nationally extinct were, in most practical cases, permanently lost from their former range. Recovery, when it happened, tended to occur through natural dispersal from surviving populations elsewhere, rather than through active reintroduction of captive-bred stock from zoos. The specific coordination required to move breeding animals across international borders, maintain them through years of captive preparation, develop the specialized monitoring technologies necessary to track post-release survival, and manage the multi-decade timescales the recovery would actually require, was, in most cases, considered logistically impossible. The Argentine giant otter program demonstrates that the assumption was wrong. It is possible. It requires specific institutional persistence over multi-decade timescales. It requires specific international cooperation across zoo networks, national governments, and conservation non-profits. It requires specific technical innovations that only emerge from the specific problems the reintroduction poses, but it can be done. If you found this story surprising, or if you found yourself thinking about the specific species declared nationally extinct across other parts of the world where similar coordination has not yet been attempted, drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you would like to see more coverage of the quiet international conservation partnerships that are quietly reversing extinctions across the modern world, working across decades and continents in ways that virtually never make headlines, consider subscribing. Some of the most important conservation breakthroughs of our era are happening exactly where you would least expect them, coordinated by people whose names you have never heard, using techniques that did not exist a decade ago. I'm Edmund Hale. Thanks for watching.